I'm a simple man. I see Big Chungus, then I leave a like. Guys, welcome back to Sleepless Tales. We're reading through Demian by Herman Hesse. We'll be starting today on Chapter 3, The Thief. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe. And let's get into the reading. Demian, Chapter 3, The Thief. There's much that I could say about the happy and tender incidents in my childhood days, the sense of security which I enjoyed with my parents, my childish affection and carefree, irresponsible existence in a gentle and affectionate ambience. But my interest is reserved for the steps that I took in my life towards self-realization. All the pleasant points of repose, islands of happiness, and paradises, whose magic was not unknown to me, can remain, as far as I am concerned, in the enchanted distance. For it is not a world that I have any particular desire to re-enter. While I linger here in my boyhood days, I'm speaking of things that were of new experiences, and carried me forward with them. These impulses came without exception from the other world, and were always attended by fear, constraint, and bad conscience. They were always revolutionary, and constituted a great threat to the peace of mind in which I would gladly have continued to live. Then came years when, once again, I could no longer hide from myself the existence of the old urge driving me back into the world of light, and to hide there. My gradual awareness of sex loomed up before me, as it does before everyone, as an enemy and destroyer, and something forbidden, corrupt, and sinful. What my curiosity had hoped for, what my dreams, desire, and fear aroused in me, and the great secret of puberty, did not fit into the circumscribed happiness of my childhood's joy. I behaved like everybody else. I led the double life of the child who was no longer a child. My conscious self lived in the homely and sanctioned. My conscious self denied the new world that was a darkling around me. And side by side with this, however, I lived in dreams and actions, desires of a subterranean kind, over which my conscious life nervously constructed a series of bridges, and my childhood's world was falling apart. Like almost all parents, mine made no attempt to foster the stirring roots of life. No reference was made to them. All they did was to go to endless trouble to bolster my hopeless attempts to deny reality and continue to dwell in a child's world, which was becoming more and more unreal and fake. It may be that my parents cannot do much about it, and I'm not trying to reproach mine. It was my own affair to see myself through and find my own way, and like most well-brought-up children, I managed it badly. Every man goes through this period of crisis. For the average man, it is the point in his life when the demands of his own fate are most at odds with his environment, when the way ahead is most hardly won. For many, it is the only time in their lives when they experience the dying and resurrection which is our lot, during the decay and slow collapse of childhood, when we are abandoned by everything that we love, and suddenly feel the loneliness and deathly cold of the world around us. And a great many people forever stay hanging onto this cliff and cling desperately their whole life through to the irrevocable past. The dream of the lost paradise, which is the worst and most ruthless of all dreams. If I turn back the pages of my story, the sensations which announce the end of my childhood are too insignificant to be mentioned. The important thing was that the dark world, the other world, was there again. What had once been Franz Cromer was now embedded in me, and in this way, the other world was gaining power over me from outside. Several years had gone by since the Cromer affair. At that time, the dramatic and guilty period of my life lay far behind me and seemed to have melted away like a brief nightmare. Franz Cromer had long vanished out of my life. I hardly gave him even a thought, even when I met him. However, the other important figure in my tragic story, Max Demian, was no longer absent from my circle. Although, for a long time, he stood at the perimeter, visible, but out of effective range. Only gradually did he come closer and radiate his strength and influence. I'm trying to think what I remember of Demian at this time. It may be that for a year or more I did not once speak to him. I avoided him, and on the few occasions when we did meet, he merely nodded at me. Sometimes I got the impression that there was a faint ring of derision and ironical reproach in his friendliness, but it may have been my fancy. The experience I had shared with him and the strange influence which he had exerted on me were as though forgotten by both of us. I'm trying to conjure up his figure, and now when I think of him, and I see that he was indeed present in my life. I can see him on his way to school, alone or among others of the senior boys, and I can see him strange, lonely and quiet, wandering aloof in their midst, surrounded by his own aura, a law unto himself. Nobody liked him. No one was on intimate terms with him, except his mother, and even with her, his relations seemed to be those of the close adults, rather than those of a child. The teachers mostly left him to himself. He was a bright pupil, but he made no attempt to please anybody, and now and again he heard of sayings, comments or retorts, which he was rumored to have made to one or other on the teachers, which, as examples of forthright and irony, left little to be desired. And as I close my eyes and reflect, I see his image rise up before me. And where was it? Oh, yes, I have it now. He was in the narrow lane in front of our house. One day, I just saw him standing there, a notebook in hand, sketching. He was drawing the old coat of arms with a bird above our front entrance, and as I stood concealed behind the curtain, watching him, I felt a deep admiration for that keen, cool, bright face turned towards the coat of arms. It was the face of a full-grown man, a scholar or artist, deliberate and purposeful, strangely clear and self-possessed, and with a discriminating eye. I see him on other occasions, a little later on, in the street. We were on our way home from school and had stopped to look at a fallen horse. It lay still, harnessed to the shaft in front of a peasant cart, snorting plaintively in the air with dilated nostrils, and bleeding from a hidden wound so that the white street dust at its side was slowly stained dark red. As I turned away with a feeling of nausea, I noticed Demian's expression. He had not thrust himself to the front, but stood right at the back, looking elegant and at ease as usual. His glance seemed directed at the horse's head, and again it showed that deep, quiet, almost fanatical yet passionate absorption. I could not help staring at him for some moments, and it was then that I felt aware of a very uncanny sensation in my remote consciousness. I saw Demian's face, and remarked that it was not a boy's face, but a man's. And then I saw, or rather became aware, that it was not really the face of a man either. It had something different about it, almost a feminine element. And for the time being, his face seemed neither masculine nor childish, neither old nor young, but 100 years old, almost timeless, and bearing the mark of other periods of history than our own. Animals might look thus, and trees or stars. I did not know then, and of course I did not feel exactly what I'm writing about it now, but as an adult, but something of the kind. Perhaps he was handsome, perhaps I found him attractive, and perhaps he repelled me too. I could not even be sure of that. All I saw was that he was different from the rest of us, that he was like an animal, a spirit or an image. I cannot describe him except to say that he was different, unimaginably different than the rest of us. My memory is blank about everything else, and perhaps, even when I have described it to some extent, is gleaned from later impressions. Only when I was several years older did I come into close touch with him. Contrary to the usual custom, Demian had not been confirmed with the other boys of his year, and once again, rumors had been rife. It was said that he was a Jew, or a heathen more likely, and some boys were convinced that he and his mother had either no religion or belonged to a fanatic and disreputable sect. In this connection, I remember having heard that he was suspected of being his mother's lover. Probably the fact of the matter was that he had been brought up without any particular religion, and this caused everybody to forecast an unsavory future for him. At all events, his mother decided not to allow him to be confirmed until 2 years after the boys in his class. So it came about that for months he attended the same confirmation classes as I did. For a time, I completely avoided him. I did not want to have anything to do with him. Too many rumors and secrets hung about him, and I was particularly disturbed by my feelings of indebtedness towards him ever since the Cromer affair. I had enough to do with my own secrets. The confirmation classes coincided with the critical period of my initiation into sex, and against my best intentions, my interest in matters of piety was thereby considerably prejudiced. The things the pastor spoke about lay remote in a quiet, holy reality of their own, All very fine and precious, doubtless, but to me they lacked the reality and excitement that the other world possessed in the highest degree. The more indifferent this attitude made me towards religious instruction, the more interested I became in Demian. A bond seemed to exist between us, and I must choose this moment to follow up that thread in my life as accurately as I can. As far as I remember, it all began one day in the early morning class when the light was still burning in the schoolroom. Our scripture teacher, a pastor, had embarked on the story of Cain and Abel. I was still sleepy and only listening with half an ear. All at once, the pastor began to hold forth about the mark of Cain in loud and excited tones. At that moment, I became aware of a stirring up inside me, a kind of challenge, looking up, I saw Demian's face turning around towards me from the front desks with that clear, eloquent glance of his, which might be expressing scorn or gravity. You cannot be sure which. He merely looked at me for a moment, and suddenly I gave the pastor's words my fullest attention, listened to him speaking of Cain and Abel and his mark, and felt deep within me this knowledge that the thing was not as he was teaching it, but that there was an alternative interpretation, and that criticism of his views was justifiable. A fresh bond was forged between Demian and myself in that moment, and strangely enough, hardly was I aware of this spiritual closeness between us when I saw it translated, as if by magic, into physical closeness. I had no idea whether he had managed to arrange it in that way, or whether it was fate. I firmly believed in strokes of fate at that time, but a few days later, Demian had suddenly changed his place in the scripture class and sat directly in front of me. I can recall how I enjoyed smelling the fresh, delicate perfume of soap from his neck in the midst of the miserable workhouse atmosphere of the overcrowded schoolroom. And again, some days later, he had changed places again and was sitting next to me, where he stayed all through winter and spring. The morning lessons now were utterly transformed. They no longer made me sleepy and bored. I looked forward to them. We would often listen to the pastor with the greatest concentration and a glance from my neighbor, and sufficed to draw my attention away to any remarkable story or strange saying. Another kind of glance, a very meaning one, sufficed to awaken critical doubts inside me. All too often, however, we were inattentive pupils, and paying little heed to the lesson. Demian was always a model of good behavior in his relations both to masters and fellow pupils. I never caught him indulging in the usual schoolboy pranks, never heard him guffaw or chatter or incur the teacher's displeasure. But, quietly, and more by means of signs and glances than whisperings, he contrived to make me share in his preoccupations. Some of these were most odd. He told me, for example, which of the other boys interested him and how he made them the subjects of his study. He knew a number of them very well. Sometimes he would say to me before the lesson, "If I give you a signal with my thumb, so-and-so will turn round and look at us, or scratch his neck, and similar things." During the lesson, often when I had forgotten all about it, Max would suddenly jerk his thumb in an odd way, for my benefit, and I would steal a rapid glance at the boy he was indicating, and on each occasion the boy would make the gesture willed upon him, as if he were a puppet on strings. I plagued Max to try this trick on a master, but he refused. Once, however, when I came into the lesson and told him I had not learned my prep, and desperately hoped that the pastor would not ask me any questions, he came to my rescue. The pastor was looking for a pupil to recite a passage of the Catechism, and his roving eye alighted on my guilty face. He slowly strode up to me and pointed his finger in my direction, and already had my name on his lips, when all at once he became distracted, looked uncomfortable, and fingered his collar. He walked up to Demian, who resolutely met his glance, and seemed to want to ask him something. But he quietly turned around again, cleared his throat a few times, and chose another pupil. Only gradually did I become aware that at the same time myself, as I was finding amusement in these jokes, I was too a frequent victim of a similar trick. Out of the feeling on my way to school that Demian was walking a short distance behind me, when I turned around, I discovered he was there in reality. "Can you really make another person think what you want?" I asked him. He answered quite readily, in his quiet, factual, grown-up way. "No," he said. "We haven't free will, whatever the pastor makes out. The other person can't think what he will any more than I can make him think what I will." It is possible, however, to think hard about someone and frequently guess what he is thinking and feeling, and then, more often than not, one can anticipate his next move. It is simple enough, and only people don't know it. Naturally, you need practice. There is, for example, a species of moth in which the females are much less common than the males. Moths breed like all animals. The male fertilizes the female who lays the eggs. If you get hold of a female in this particular species of moth, the experiment has often been tried by naturalists. The males come flying to this female in the night for hours on end. Just think, we're several miles around these males and smell only the female in the district. We try to find an explanation, but it is difficult. They must have a sense of smell or something. It is like the way good gun dogs can pick up and follow what would appear to be an imperceptible scent. Do you get the idea? It's the kind of inexplicable thing that nature abounds in. This, however, I can say. If the females were as common as the males among these moths, the latter would not have such a fine nose. They've acquired that merely because they've trained themselves to it. If an animal, or a man, bends his whole will to a certain end, he achieves it. It's as simple as that. And that is how it is in the present case. Examine a man closely enough, and you'll soon know more about him than he does himself. It was on the tip of my tongue to mention the word thought reading, and remind him of the scene which was now so remote. But the subject had become taboo between us, and neither he nor I ever made the vaguest allusion to the fact that several years ago he had seriously concerned himself with my life. It was as if no previous relationship had ever existed between us, as if each of us presumed the other had forgotten about it. Indeed, it happened to one or two occasions that, as we were walking along the street, we encountered Franz Cromer. Yet, neither of us exchanged a glance or mentioned a word about him. "But what is this will business?" I asked him. "You say that we don't possess free will, but then again you say one only needs to fix one's will resolutely on some object to achieve it. Doesn't make sense. If I'm not master of my own will, then I'm not in a position to direct it here or there as I wish." He slapped me on the back as he always did, when he was pleased with me. "Good for you. I'm glad you asked," he said, laughing. "You must always ask. You must always doubt. But it is a very simple matter. If, for example, a night moth wanted to direct his will on a star or some equally remote object, he would fail. He doesn't even make the attempt. He confines his search for what would make sense to him. That is, what he needs, what is indispensable to him. And he achieves the miraculous. He develops a magic sixth sense which no other creature possesses but him. There is more scope and interest in the case of human beings than of animals. But even we are bounded within a pretty narrow circle beyond which we may not stray. It is all very well for me to imagine this or that. Imagine I'll get to the North Pole or some such idea, but I can focus my will strongly enough on it, only if the wish is really so deeply rooted within me that it permeates my whole being. Once that is the case, once you feel what is required of you from within, all is well, and you can harness your will like an obedient horse. It is no use, for example, my undertaking to will that our pastor shall take to wearing spectacles. He would be reducing the thing to a game. But when that time in autumn I made the firm resolution to be shifted from my desk in the front of the class, it was effective. A boy suddenly turned up, whose name preceded mine in the alphabet, and who had been away ill before, and as someone had to take his place, I was given it because my will was ready to seize the opportunity. "Yes," I said. I remember having a special feeling at the time, but from the moment when we took an interest in each other, you began to get closer to me, literally. But how did it come about you? You did not come and sit by me straight away. You were content to sit on the bench in front of me occasionally, weren't you? Why was that? Yes, that is so. I did not know myself, where I wanted to be, when I wanted to shift from my original place. I merely knew that I wanted to sit further back. It was my wish to get closer to you, and that, to begin with, was quite unconscious. At the same time, your will accorded with mine and helped me. Only when I found myself sitting in front of you did I realize that my wish was only half fulfilled, and that my sole wish had been to sit next to you. But there wasn't a new boy joining the class just then. No, but I was merely doing what I wanted, and the last time I sat down next to you without further thought. The boy with whom I changed places was too taken aback to object, and the pastor too noticed on one occasion that there had been a swap round. But every time he had to do with me, nothing appeared to disturb him. He knew my name was Demian, and that something was wrong, and that since my name began with a D, I had to not be sitting directly behind an S. But the thought did not penetrate his consciousness because my will opposed it, and because I continued to thwart him. He kept noticing that something was odd, and the good man looked at me and tried to puzzle it out, but I had a simple expedient. I stirred him out on each occasion. It's a treatment very few people can stand. They all become uncomfortable. If you want to get something out of someone, and you look him in the eye, unexpectedly and resolutely, he doesn't become ill at ease. Give it up. You'll never get anywhere with him. Never. But that is a rare occurrence. In actual fact, I know only one person with whom it is ineffective. And who is that? I asked him quickly. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, as they did when he became thoughtful. Then he turned away and gave no reply. And though I was profoundly curious, I could not repeat the question. I believe, however, that he had his mother in mind. He seemed very closely bound up with her. Yet he never as much as mentioned her name, and never took me along to their house. I hardly knew what his mother looked like. And guys, that is where we'll pause on Demian. Okay, this is chapter 3 still. I'll catch you in the next part 2 of chapter 3. We are on page 64. Okay. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Goodbye.